Right now, somewhere on the surface of your body, a nerve ending smaller than a grain of sand is quietly deciding whether or not to fire a signal toward your brain. You are not thinking about it. You probably haven't thought about your skin at all in the last few minutes, and yet it has been busy the entire time, running a kind of continuous, low-level surveillance that never quite switches off. Even now, even as your eyes grow heavy and your breathing starts to slow, somewhere near your collarbone, or the back of your knee, or the edge of your scalp where hair meets skin, a fiber no thicker than a strand of spider silk is sitting in a state of readiness, waiting for something to change. This is happening everywhere on you at once, though you'll only ever notice it in one place at a time. Your body simply doesn't have the bandwidth to alert you to every square centimeter of skin simultaneously, so instead, it keeps a rotating, half-conscious watch, sampling here and there, mostly filtering things out. A shirt collar against your neck, the weight of a blanket settling over your shoulder, the faint press of the mattress beneath you. All of it is technically detected, and almost all of it is technically ignored, filed away by a nervous system that has learned, over years of practice, which sensations deserve your attention and which ones don't. And then, every so often, something gets through. It might be so faint you'd have trouble describing it. Not quite a touch, not quite a temperature, a kind of tiny electrical murmur arriving from a patch of skin on your forearm or your ankle or somewhere on your back you can't easily reach even if you tried. For a moment, it sits just below the threshold of your attention, the way a sound outside a window sits below the threshold of hearing until you happen to stop talking and notice it's been there all along. And then, almost without your permission, your attention swings toward it. You register it, you feel it, you itch. It's a strange word when you slow down and actually look at it. Short, almost childish, one of those words we learn so early that we never really examine it again. We say, a mosquito bite itches, a wool sweater itches, a scar itches as it heals, a healing scab itches until it finally lets go. We use the same word for 100 different sensations that don't actually feel identical if you pay close attention to them. There's the sharp, localized itch of a bug bite, insistent and specific, practically shouting the exact coordinates of where it wants you to scratch. There's the diffuse, wandering itch that seems to drift across your back, like weather, impossible to pin to one spot. There's the deep itch, somewhere beneath the skin, that scratching barely touches. There's the itch that arrives the instant you simply think about it, as though your brain, upon being reminded that itching exists, decided to go ahead and manufacture one on the spot. That last kind is worth pausing on, gently, because it tells you something important before we've even properly started. An itch is not purely a message arriving from your skin. It is a message that your brain constructs, using signals from your skin as raw material, the way a chef uses raw ingredients to make a finished dish. The ingredients matter enormously, but so does the kitchen, so does the cook. Two people can receive the exact same physical stimulus on their skin and experience it differently, and the same person can experience the same stimulus differently, depending on the time of day, their mood, how tired they are, or simply whether someone nearby just mentioned the word itch out loud. You may have already felt that happening tonight. It's a small, almost embarrassing thing about human attention. The moment a person starts talking about itching, other people in earshot often feel one arrive, somewhere, as if the very idea of it goes looking for a place to land. There's nothing mystical about this. It isn't proof that itching is imaginary, or that it's somehow not real. It's simply a demonstration of how much of what you feel depends on what your brain has decided is worth paying attention to, in this particular moment, in this particular body, on this particular night. For most of human history, nobody had a good answer for why any of this happened. Ancient physicians noticed itching constantly, because of course they did. People have always lived surrounded by insects, wool, dust, dry air, healing wounds, and the countless small irritations of being alive inside a body that has to touch the world in order to survive in it. Doctors in ancient Greece wrote about itching as a kind of minor cousin to pain, a lesser irritation that shared some vague kinship with a paper cut or a burn, but never quite rose to the same seriousness. For roughly 2,000 years afterward, that basic assumption barely moved. Itch was treated as pain's weaker sibling, riding along on the same nerves, differing only in strength, the way a whisper differs from a shout. That idea felt reasonable enough that almost nobody questioned it seriously, until surprisingly recently, historically speaking. It wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that researchers began building the tools needed to look closely enough at individual nerve fibers to ask a much stranger question. What if itch and pain aren't the same signal at different volumes at all? What if they are, at least in part, separate systems, using some of the same wiring, but carrying genuinely different messages, the way two different radio stations can share a single antenna tower, but broadcast completely different programs? We'll spend time on that question properly, later, because it turns out to be one of the more satisfying surprises in the whole story of itching. One of those places where science quietly overturned something that had seemed obvious for millennia. But for now, in this early, unhurried stretch of the night, it's enough to simply notice the itch as it is, without needing to explain it yet. To notice that it arrives from nowhere, seemingly on its own schedule, indifferent to whether you were in the middle of falling asleep, or reading, or simply lying still with your eyes closed, listening to the quiet. And to notice, too, what tends to happen next. Because an itch, almost the moment it's felt, brings a small companion along with it, an urge. Not a thought, exactly, more like a pull, a suggestion arriving from somewhere beneath conscious reasoning, proposing, quite insistently, that your hand ought to move. That a finger should travel to that exact patch of skin and drag itself across it, back and forth, until the sensation changes into something else. This urge is remarkably specific. It doesn't ask you to press. It doesn't ask you to rub gently in slow circles the way you might soothe an ache. It asks, very precisely, for scratching. For the particular combination of light pressure and rapid motion that somehow, for reasons we'll get to slowly across the rest of this journey, manages to interrupt the itching signal, at least for a little while. You may already be noticing your own hand right now. Fingers shifting slightly, a faint pull toward some spot on your arm or your neck or your leg. This is completely ordinary. It's one of the most universal experiences a nervous system can produce, shared not just across every human culture, but across an enormous range of other animals too, from dogs kicking a hind leg in their sleep, to birds preening a single feather over and over, to mice grooming the same small patch of fur with what looks, to any observer, exactly like irritation. Wherever there is skin, and wherever there is a nervous system paying attention to that skin, something very much like itching tends to show up, along with something very much like the urge to scratch it. What's strange, if you slow down enough to really look at it, is how automatic the whole sequence feels, and how little say your conscious mind seems to have in it. You don't decide to itch. You don't decide to want to scratch. Both arrive together, uninvited, as a package, the way a sneeze arrives, or a yawn, fully formed sensations complete with their own built-in instructions for what your body should do about them. And yet, underneath that automatic feeling, there is an enormous amount of biological machinery quietly at work, coordinating between skin and spinal cord and brain, machinery that took evolution hundreds of millions of years to build, and scientists only a few short decades to begin properly mapping. We're going to walk through that machinery together tonight, slowly, one small piece at a time, the way you might walk through an old house, room by room, in no particular hurry, pausing wherever something catches your interest. We'll start with the very simplest question of all, the one that turns out to be far less simple than it sounds. What, exactly, is happening in your skin, at the level of a single nerve fiber, in the fraction of a second before you even notice that something itches? For a very long time, people who thought carefully about the body assumed that itch was simply a weak form of pain. It seemed like the obvious explanation. A mosquito bite hurts a little, the reasoning went, just not enough to register as real pain, so the nervous system files it under some lesser category and calls it itch instead. This idea had a name, the intensity theory, and it held on for the better part of a century, taught in medical schools, printed in textbooks, accepted by researchers who had no particular reason to question it. It made a kind of tidy sense. Pain and itch both come from the skin. Both make you want to do something about them immediately. Both can be triggered by things that seem, on the surface, quite similar: a scrape, a sting, a rash, a burn. Why wouldn't they simply be 2 points on the same dial, one turned up loud and one turned down soft? But if you have ever actually experienced both in the same evening, you already know, in your body, if not in your words, that something about this explanation feels wrong. Think about the difference. If you press your hand against a hot pan, the response is immediate and singular. You pull away. There is no ambiguity in the instruction your nervous system is sending you. Move this part of you away from that thing, now. But an itch does not tell you to move away from anything. It tells you to move toward. It draws your hand in, not out. It asks you to make contact with the very spot that is bothering you, to press on it, drag across it, dig into it if necessary, which is a completely different kind of instruction than pain ever gives. Pain pushes. Itch pulls. And a nervous system that was simply turning the same dial up or down would have no reason to reverse the direction of the response like that. You would expect a weak burn to make you want to weakly pull away, not to make you want to lean in and scratch. There's another clue, too, one that took researchers by surprise when they started paying close attention to it in the later decades of the 20th century. If you block pain in a particular patch of skin using certain drugs, itch in that same patch doesn't go away. In some cases, it gets worse. This is the opposite of what you'd expect if itch were merely a diluted form of pain. If itch were pain's quiet cousin,
silencing pain should silence itch along with it, the way turning off a loud radio also turns off whatever song was playing underneath it too quietly to notice before. But that isn't what happens. The two systems can be pulled apart, pharmacologically, in a laboratory, which strongly suggests they were never really the same system to begin with. They just happen to share a neighborhood. By the final years of the 20th century and into the early 21st, a growing number of researchers had become convinced that itch deserved to be understood as its own distinct category of sensation entirely, with its own name drawn from the Latin pruritus, its own dedicated pathways, and its own evolutionary purpose. Not pain's understudy, a performer in its own right, with its own reason for existing, and that purpose, once you see it clearly, turns out to be almost beautifully specific. Pain, broadly speaking, exists to protect you from things that are already touching you, or already inside you, a splinter, a cut, a burn, an injury already underway.
Itch, by contrast, seems to exist largely to protect you from things that are on you, but not yet doing serious damage. A mosquito that has landed but hasn't finished feeding, a single thread of spiderweb brushing your cheek in the dark, a flea working its way through fur or hair or the fabric of a sleeve, a plant's fine hairs settling onto skin. Itch is, in a sense, an early warning system, tuned to catch small, surface-level intrusions before they become larger ones, and its solution isn't to make you flee. Its solution is to make you sweep the intruder away with your own hand, which is precisely what scratching accomplishes, at least in the simplest and oldest version of the story. This distinction becomes easier to feel if you imagine, just for a moment, a version of yourself with no capacity to itch at all, only pain. A tick could walk across your forearm for several minutes, searching for a place to settle, and you would feel nothing at all until it had already bitten you, and pain arrived to tell you the damage was done. Itch, in that scenario, is the sensation that would have warned you far earlier, while the tick was still just a lightly moving pressure on the skin, too faint and too specific to register as touch, but exactly the kind of faint, specific, moving pressure that the itch system seems built to notice. Some researchers describe this as itch functioning like a kind of skin-level vigilance, always faintly running in the background, checking for small foreign movements against a surface that pain alone would leave completely unguarded until it was already too late to matter. None of this works, though, unless we take seriously what the skin itself actually is, because so much of the confusion around itching comes from an old habit of thinking about skin as though it were simple, a sort of wrapping paper, a covering, passive and inert, whose only job is to keep the inside of you inside and the outside of you outside. That picture is centuries old and stubbornly persistent, and it is almost entirely wrong. Skin is not wrapping paper. Skin is one of the most biologically active organs you have, and in fact it is, by surface area, the largest organ in the human body, an adult's skin covering somewhere close to 2 square meters, roughly the size of a small blanket laid flat, containing within that thin, flexible sheet an extraordinary density of specialized machinery, blood vessels, sweat glands, oil glands, hair follicles, each one wired with its own tiny muscle, immune cells stationed like sentries, and nerve endings, millions upon millions of them, some built to detect pressure, some built to detect vibration, some built to detect temperature so precisely
They can register a change of a single degree, and some, a particular subset, will spend real time with later tonight, built for nothing else in the world except detecting the earliest signs of an itch. Historically, the people who studied skin most closely were not always doctors in the modern sense. Long before anyone had a microscope capable of resolving a nerve fiber, healers and physicians across very different cultures, from ancient Chinese medical texts to Greek and Roman writers like Galen, noticed and recorded the itch-scratch cycle as something worth naming and worth trying to explain, even without any access to the cellular story underneath it. They knew, from careful observation alone, that itching seemed to travel, that scratching one spot could sometimes seem to summon itching in another, that certain skin conditions produced itch so relentless it clearly wasn't just a minor cousin of pain, because people suffering from it would describe wanting relief from the itching even when scratching had already begun to hurt. That detail alone, the willingness to accept pain in exchange for scratching, should have been evidence enough, centuries ago, that itch and pain were not simply two strengths of the same signal. If they were, why would you deliberately choose the more painful action instead of just tolerating the itch? But the biological explanation for why anyone would make that trade wouldn't arrive for a very long time yet. What we now understand, and what makes skin worth thinking of as active rather than passive, is that it is constantly making decisions, or at least constantly sending information upward that allows decisions to be made elsewhere. It is less like wrapping paper and more like a coastline, a living boundary between two different worlds, endlessly monitored, endlessly reactive, dense with outposts, whose only function is to notice something crossing that line and to report it immediately to a nervous system that has to decide, faster than conscious thought allows, whether what just happened deserves a flinch, a wince, a shiver, or that oddly specific and oddly urgent little signal we call an itch. And to really understand how skin makes that particular judgment call, we need to go smaller still, past the visible surface, down to the individual nerve fibers threading up through it, quietly, waiting.
Those nerve fibers are not, as it turns out, one uniform kind of wire. For a long stretch of the 20th century, scientists assumed itch was carried by the same class of nerve fibers that carried pain, just fired more gently, more sparingly, the way a whisper is a quieter version of a shout. It was a tidy theory. It was also, we now know, wrong, or at least badly incomplete. Buried among the ordinary pain-sensing fibers in the skin is a smaller, specialized population, ones that seem to do almost nothing in response to a pinprick or a burn, but come alive, unmistakably, in response to substances like histamine. These are sometimes called itch-specific fibers, though even that name is a little too clean for how messy the real picture is. What matters for a sleepy, unhurried explanation is simply this: your skin does not have one alarm system with a volume dial. It has several, overlapping, sometimes agreeing with each other and sometimes not, each tuned to notice different kinds of trouble. Histamine is the one most people have heard of, mostly because of allergies, and it deserves its moment of attention, if only because it's the messenger science figured out first. It's stored in small cells called mast cells, which sit in the skin like sentries with their alarm bells already loaded, ready to ring the instant something they recognize as a threat shows up. When a mosquito bites you, it isn't just drawing blood and leaving. It's injecting a small amount of its own saliva first, a fluid that contains proteins meant to keep your blood from clotting while it feeds, because a mosquito is, in its own small and irritating way, trying to keep the tap open just long enough to get a meal. Your body notices those foreign proteins almost immediately and treats them the way it treats any uninvited guest, which is to say, with suspicion, and the mast cells nearby release histamine as part of the response. That histamine drifts to the itch-sensitive nerve endings close by, binds to receptors on their surface, almost like a key finding the one lock it fits, and those nerves fire off a signal that eventually becomes the specific, localized, maddening itch of a mosquito bite. It's a strange kind of elegance, when you think about it slowly enough. An insect's attempt to feed quietly instead sets off a very loud biological alarm, and the alarm is the itch you feel hours after the mosquito itself is long gone. But if histamine were the whole story, antihistamine medication would cure every itch there is, and anyone who has ever dealt with dry winter skin, or the itch that comes with certain nerve conditions, or the deep, persistent itch of some liver and kidney diseases, knows firsthand that it doesn't. This is where the second half of the picture comes in, the part researchers only pieced together more recently, which is that there are histamine-independent pathways too, itch signals carried by entirely different chemical messengers, using different receptors, sometimes even different nerve fibers altogether. One of these involves a compound called substance P, which nudges immune cells called mast cells to release their contents through a slightly different door than the one histamine typically uses. Another involves receptors that respond not to histamine at all, but to other small molecules the body produces during inflammation, or in response to certain drugs, or even in response to bile compounds that build up when the liver isn't clearing them properly. This is why some of the most stubborn, most exhausting itches, the kind that seem to have no obvious rash, no bite mark, no visible cause at all, often don't respond to the medications people instinctively reach for first. The itch is real. The mechanism just isn't the one antihistamines were built to interrupt. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it reframes something that can otherwise feel discouraging. An itch with no visible answer isn't a mystery in the sense of being unexplainable. It's a mystery in the sense of pointing to a different pathway than the familiar one, a different messenger, ringing a different bell. Nettles offer a good example of just how many messengers can be involved at once. The tiny hollow hairs on a nettle leaf work almost like microscopic hypodermic needles, breaking off at a sharp angle when brushed against skin and injecting a small cocktail of irritating chemicals, histamine among them, but also acetylcholine and formic acid and a few other compounds whose combined effect is to produce not just itching, but often a stinging, burning sensation layered on top of it. That layering is a clue in itself. It suggests that pain and itch pathways, while distinct, aren't sealed off from each other in separate rooms. They're more like neighboring departments that sometimes get pulled into the same case, comparing notes, both reporting to the same tired supervisor upstairs. Allergic reactions tell a related but different kind of story, because there, the trigger isn't a plant's chemical defense or an insect's feeding strategy, but the body's own immune system reacting to something that, biologically speaking, probably didn't deserve such a dramatic response in the first place. Pollen, certain foods, pet dander, dust mite droppings, so small and so seemingly harmless, and yet, in a sensitized person's body, the immune system has essentially filed a case against them, decided they're dangerous, and prepared antibodies specifically shaped to recognize them on sight. The next time that substance turns up, those antibodies flag it immediately. Mast cells release histamine and other compounds in response,
and the resulting itch can show up not just at the point of contact, but as a more generalized, restless, whole-body sensation, hives rising and fading, skin that seems to itch in shifting locations rather than staying put. It's the same fundamental chemistry as the mosquito bite in some ways, histamine doing much of the announcing, but the scale and the trigger are different enough that it feels like an entirely separate experience from the inside. Then there's the itch that seems to come from nothing at all, the itch of simply dry skin, which turns out to be its own small case study in how many ways the same sensation can be produced. Skin that's lost too much moisture develops tiny cracks in its outermost layer, breaks in what's usually a fairly effective barrier, and this seems to expose nerve endings that are normally more insulated from the outside world, more shielded from minor chemical and mechanical noise. Without that buffer, ordinary changes in temperature, ordinary contact with clothing, even just the natural movement of skin as you shift in bed, can be enough to nudge those nerve endings into firing. There may be no mosquito, no nettle, no allergen at all. Just a barrier grown thin enough that the usual background hum of the world starts to register as something worth reporting. And then, curiously, there's the itch of healing, the itch that shows up not when something is going wrong, but when something is actively getting better. A scab forming over a cut, a burn slowly regenerating new tissue underneath, a bruise fading back into ordinary skin. All of these repair processes involve a burst of cellular activity, new skin cells multiplying, blood vessels reforming, immune cells clearing away debris, and a number of the chemical signals involved in orchestrating all of that repair happen to be some of the very same molecules that can trigger nerve endings to fire an itch signal. It's almost incidental, in a sense. The itch of healing may not be a message with any real urgency behind it at all, more a kind of chemical spillover from an entirely different, entirely constructive process happening just beneath the surface, the nervous system picking up static from a construction site rather than an actual alarm.
So by the time all these threads are laid out side by side, the mosquito bite and the nettle sting and the allergic hive and the dry patch on your elbow and the itch along a healing scar, it starts to become clear that itch was never one single thing pretending to be many. It was always many different processes, sharing a final common pathway, all converging on the same signal because that signal happens to be a useful shorthand for the nervous system to use, no matter what set it off. Which raises a quieter question, one that's easy to overlook in the middle of just wanting relief. What is that signal actually for? Not chemically, but purposefully. What was evolution trying to accomplish by giving so many different problems the exact same emotional weight and the exact same behavioral demand? Let's follow that signal somewhere more specific, away from the skin itself and into the narrow, dim corridor where it first gets translated into something the rest of the nervous system can use. Because a nerve ending firing in the skin is really only step one. That signal has to travel, and the place it travels to first is the spinal cord. And it's here, in that unglamorous relay station tucked inside the bones of your back, that a lot of the stranger features of itch actually get decided. Picture the very end of one of those itch-sensitive nerve fibers out at the surface of the skin, receiving its chemical nudge, whether that's histamine or one of its many alternatives. The fiber itself is long and thin, almost thread-like, and it runs from the skin all the way back to a cluster of nerve cell bodies sitting just outside the spinal cord in small knots called dorsal root ganglia. You don't need to remember that term. What matters is the shape of the journey. Signal starts at the skin, travels the length of the fiber, arrives at the edge of the spinal cord, and then, crucially, has to cross a gap to the next nerve cell in line, the one that will actually carry the message upward toward the brain. And that crossing point, that handoff, is where things get interesting. For a long time, the working assumption among scientists was that itch didn't really deserve its own private wiring at all. The dominant idea, going back decades, was that itch was simply a weak or low-level version of pain, using the exact same pathways, the exact same relay cells, just firing more gently. A mosquito bite, on this view, was just a very quiet cousin of a burn. It's an appealingly simple idea, and it even explains a few things reasonably well, but it turns out to be incomplete, and figuring out why it was incomplete took a surprisingly long time and a fair amount of clever experimental work, some of it not resolved with real confidence until the early 2000s. What researchers eventually found, working largely in mice at first, and then confirming pieces of it in humans, is that there does seem to be a population of spinal cord relay cells that respond specifically to itch signals and are far less interested in pain signals, alongside other relay cells that do the reverse. Not a perfectly clean separation, the biology rarely offers that kind of tidiness, but a real and meaningful specialization. There are molecules, receptors sitting on the surface of certain spinal neurons that seem to matter specifically for itch transmission, and when researchers have selectively removed or blocked those neurons in animal studies, itching responses dropped dramatically, while pain responses stayed largely intact. That's a fairly strong piece of evidence for at least partially dedicated wiring, existing right alongside the older shared pathways, rather than itch being nothing more than diluted pain. So the picture that's emerged, and it's still being filled in, is less like a single road and more like a set of overlapping lanes on the same highway. Some fibers seem to specialize quite heavily in itch. Others carry pain most of the time, but can be recruited into carrying itch-like signals under sometimes unusual circumstances. And crucially, these lanes aren't perfectly sealed off from one another. They interact. They can inhibit each other. They can occasionally cross over. And that overlapping, imperfectly separated arrangement turns out to explain a whole lot of everyday experience that would otherwise seem mysterious. Consider, for instance, the simple, almost universal act of scratching. Why does dragging your fingernails across an itchy patch of skin bring even a few seconds of relief, when logically, you'd think adding more sensation to an already irritated patch of skin would only make things worse? The answer seems to lie in exactly this overlap between pathways, in the spinal cord itself, at that handoff point. Scratching activates pain and light touch fibers alongside the itch fibers, sending a rush of competing signals into the very same relay station. And there is reasonably good evidence, from both animal studies and some human work, that those pain and touch signals can actively suppress the transmission of itch signals at that junction, at least temporarily. It isn't only, or even mainly, that scratching creates a louder sensation that distracts your attention away from the itch, the way stubbing your toe might distract you from a minor headache elsewhere in your body. It appears to be something more directly wired than that, an actual gate, sitting right there at the entrance to the spinal cord, and pain signals arriving at that gate seem able to partially close it against itch signals trying to get through at the same moment. This idea of a gate in the spinal cord that can be opened or closed depending on what other signals are arriving alongside it isn't actually a new concept invented for itch. It borrows heavily from an older and quite famous idea in the study of pain, called gate control theory, proposed back in 1965 by a psychologist named Ronald Melzack
and an anatomist named Patrick Wall. Their original idea was about explaining why simply rubbing an area you've just bumped or bruised can ease the pain, and it turned out, decades later, that something structurally similar seems to be happening with itch as well, even though the theory wasn't originally built with itch in mind at all. It's a nice example, actually, of how progress in understanding one sensation can quietly illuminate another one entirely, years down the line, in a completely different corner of the same research field. Of course, this raises an obvious follow-up question, and it's one worth sitting with for a moment, since it explains something almost everyone has noticed but rarely thinks through. If scratching closes the gate and blocks the itch signal, however briefly, why doesn't that relief last? Why does the itch so often creep back within moments, sometimes even more insistent than before, dragging you into another round of scratching, and then another, in a cycle that can go on for uncomfortably long stretches, especially late at night, when there's nothing else competing for your attention? Part of the answer seems to be timing. That gating effect from pain and touch signals appears to be brief, lasting only seconds at most, because the nervous system doesn't sustain that kind of competing signal indefinitely, and once the extra input from scratching fades, the itch fibers, which are often still actively being stimulated by whatever chemical trigger set them off in the first place, resume sending their signal largely unopposed. But there's a second, less comfortable part of the answer too, and it has to do with actual tissue damage. Scratching, especially vigorous or repeated scratching, can injure the very outer layers of skin, disrupting that barrier we talked about earlier, and in doing so, it can trigger the release of even more of the itch-provoking chemicals your body produces as part of ordinary injury response.
In other words, scratching doesn't just fail to solve the underlying problem, it can, in a very real physical sense, manufacture a fresh new supply of irritation to replace the itch it just briefly silenced. It's less like turning down a stereo and more like turning down a stereo by unplugging one speaker while accidentally kicking on another somewhere else in the room. This is also, incidentally, part of why certain other sensations, besides scratching, can dial an itch up or down, sometimes without any scratching at all. Heat tends to make itching feel more intense, for many people, part of why a hot shower can bring short-lived relief, followed by a rebound flare, since warmth increases blood flow to the skin and seems to make those nerve endings somewhat more excitable. Cold, meanwhile, often has the opposite effect, calming things down, which is part of why a cool cloth or a cold pack can feel so soothing on an itchy patch of skin, quieting the signal rather than competing with it the way scratching does. Even gentle, sustained pressure, the kind you get from firmly pressing a hand flat against an itchy spot rather than scratching it, seems to recruit some of that same gating machinery in the spinal cord, offering relief without the collateral damage that comes from raking fingernails across already sensitive skin. All of which means that itch was never simply a message traveling in one straight, uninterrupted line from your skin to your awareness. By the time a signal has crossed that first junction inside your spinal cord, it has already been shaped, filtered, sometimes suppressed, sometimes amplified, by whatever else happens to be arriving at that same junction in the same narrow window of time, which leaves an interesting question hanging in the quiet dark of a bedroom late at night, when nothing but the itch itself seems to be competing for that gate. When there is nothing else arriving at that gate, the signal that does get through has an easier road ahead of it, and it's worth following that road the rest of the way, because the itch you feel is not manufactured at the site of the mosquito bite or the wool sweater or the dry patch of winter skin on your shin. It's manufactured, in the fullest sense of that word, somewhere behind your eyes, in tissue that has never once come into contact with anything scratchy or biting or irritating. The skin sends a pattern of electrical pulses. The brain is the one that turns that pattern into the specific, unmistakable, maddening quality we call itchiness. That handoff happens in stages, and each stage adds something the raw signal didn't have on its own. The first stop, once a signal has cleared that spinal gate we've been talking about, is a relay deep in the middle of the brain called the thalamus, which acts something like a switchboard operator in an old telephone exchange, taking incoming calls from every part of the body and routing each one to the department that needs to hear it. The thalamus doesn't know or particularly care what itching feels like. Its job is simpler and more mechanical than that. It receives the signal, tags it as belonging to a certain patch of skin on a certain side of the body, and forwards it onward to several destinations at once, because a single itch, it turns out, is never handled by just one region of the brain working alone. It's handled by several regions working in a kind of loose, overlapping committee, each contributing a different piece of the finished experience. One of those regions is the primary somatosensory cortex, a strip of tissue running roughly from ear to ear across the top of the brain, organized in a way that neuroscientists sometimes describe using the image of a small distorted person mapped across its surface, with disproportionately large territory devoted to the lips, the hands, the face, and comparatively little devoted to, say, the middle of the back. This is the part of the brain responsible for answering the question of where, not why it itches, not how bad it is, just where. It's the reason you can identify, often without even looking, that the itch is on your left forearm, 2 inches below the elbow, rather than somewhere vaguely upper body. That kind of precision seems almost unremarkable until you try to imagine living without it, having to visually hunt across your own arm to locate a sensation your body ought to be able to place immediately. But knowing where something itches doesn't tell you how unpleasant it is, and that's a separate computation, handled by a different part of the brain altogether, a region tucked deeper inside called the anterior cingulate cortex, along with a structure near the base of the brain called the insula. These regions specialize less in location and more in what researchers sometimes call the affective dimension of a sensation, meaning its emotional weight, its badness, the part of the experience that makes you want it to stop. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means the itch you locate and the itch you suffer from are, at some level, 2 separate signals running through 2 separate neural neighborhoods, and they don't always agree with each other in intensity. It's part of why the exact same itch can feel almost tolerable on a busy afternoon and nearly unbearable at 2 in the morning, even though the sensory information reaching the somatosensory cortex, the raw where and how strong, may be nearly identical in both cases. What changes is how much unpleasantness the emotional centers of the brain are layering on top of that raw data, and that layering is itself sensitive to fatigue, to stress, to mood, to how much else the brain has on its plate at any given moment. Then there's a third piece, arguably the piece most responsible for turning a mere sensation into a small, urgent event, and that's the motor system, the network of brain regions responsible for planning and initiating movement. An itch, unlike most other sensations, comes bundled with what researchers call an action tendency,
an intrinsic pull toward a specific physical response, in this case, scratching. You don't merely notice an itch the way you might notice a faint smell or a change in room temperature. You notice it and, in the same breath, feel a small but insistent nudge toward doing something about it. That nudge appears to involve the premotor cortex, a region that sits just in front of the primary motor strip and specializes in preparing movements before they happen, essentially drafting the plan for a scratch before your hand has moved an inch. This is part of why suppressing the urge to scratch in the middle of a lecture, in a meeting, lying still trying to fall asleep, takes real effort, a kind of quiet tug-of-war between the premotor cortex drafting its scratching plan and other, more deliberate parts of the frontal lobe vetoing that plan moment by moment.
So by the time an itch reaches your full conscious awareness, it isn't a single unified signal at all. It's really four things arriving together and merging so seamlessly that they feel like one: a location, supplied by the somatosensory cortex, an unpleasantness rating, supplied by the cingulate cortex and insula, a motor urge, supplied by the premotor cortex, and, threaded through all three, a fourth ingredient that might be the strangest of the bunch, which is attention itself. Attention turns out to behave almost like a magnifying lens for itch, and not a gentle one. In laboratory studies where people are exposed to a mild, controlled itch stimulus, something as unremarkable as a small dose of histamine applied to a patch of skin, researchers can manipulate how intensely people rate that itch simply by manipulating where their attention is pointed, with no change whatsoever to the actual chemical stimulus on the skin. Ask someone to concentrate closely on the itchy spot, to really focus on it, and the reported intensity climbs. Distract that same person with an absorbing mental task, something that occupies working memory, a puzzle, a story, a conversation that actually holds their interest, and the reported intensity of that identical stimulus drops, sometimes considerably. The itch hasn't changed. The chemical is still there, doing exactly what it was doing before. What's changed is how much neural real estate the brain has devoted to processing it, and it appears that itch, more than many other bodily sensations, is unusually dependent on that spotlight of attention to reach its full intensity. This helps make sense of an experience almost everyone has had, which is the itch that seems to appear the moment you notice it, and worse, seems to grow the longer you keep noticing it. Lying in bed, mind otherwise quiet, there's a strange feedback loop that can spin up almost automatically. You feel a faint itch. You turn your attention toward it to evaluate what it is and whether it's worth doing anything about. And that very act of turning attention toward it appears to recruit more cortical processing devoted to the sensation, which in turn makes it feel stronger, which in turn draws still more attention, and so on, each pass through the loop adding a little more amplification than the last. It isn't that you're imagining the itch, or exaggerating it through some failure of willpower. It's that itch, unlike, say, background noise from a distant road, seems to be built in a way that rewards attention with intensity, almost as though the brain treats a closely watched itch as more urgent than one that's merely present but unexamined. And this is precisely why an itch so often seems to vanish, or at least fade, into something easily ignored during moments of genuine absorption. Deep in conversation, deep in a good book, deep in a task that actually engages working memory rather than simply occupying idle time,
The itch that felt unbearable 5 minutes earlier can slip almost entirely from awareness, not because the underlying stimulus has stopped, the histamine, or the dry skin, or the healing wound is still doing whatever it was doing, but because the brain's limited attentional resources have been pulled elsewhere, leaving less machinery available to run that amplification loop. This is also, worth noting quietly here, part of why itching so often seems to intensify specifically at bedtime, in the dim, quiet moments before sleep, when the ordinary daytime supply of distractions, conversation, tasks, the small continuous business of being awake in a busy world, has been stripped away, leaving attention with very little else to land on, besides whatever sensations the body happens to be generating.
So the itch has your attention now, lying there in the quiet, and there's really only one thing the body knows how to do about that. You scratch. And here is where something curious happens, something that took researchers a surprisingly long time to properly untangle, because the relief is so fast, so complete in the moment, that it hardly seems to need explaining. Of course, scratching helps. It feels like the most obvious thing in the world, but ask why it helps, mechanically, physiologically, and the answer turns out to be a small detour through the nervous system's handling of pain, not comfort. When fingernails drag across skin, especially with any real pressure, they don't just interrupt the itch, they introduce something new, a mild, low-grade pain signal. And pain, it turns out, has a peculiar relationship with itch in the spinal cord, the very first relay station where these signals arrive on their way up to the brain. Neurons living in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, a thin ribbon of tissue running the length of the back, receive input from both itch fibers and pain fibers, and in a discovery that reshaped how scientists think about the two sensations, it appears that pain signals can actively suppress the transmission of itch signals at this very first junction, before the message has even had a chance to travel further up toward conscious awareness. Scratch hard enough to sting a little, and you are, in effect, sending in a competing signal that the spinal cord treats as more urgent, and itch, at least for a while, gets pushed down the priority list. There's an elegant, almost architectural logic to this, the kind of thing that seems obvious in hindsight, but wasn't obvious at all until researchers went looking for it with careful animal studies and, later, human ones using controlled mechanical or thermal pain alongside chemically induced itch. Pain, evolutionarily, tends to signal something more urgent than itch. A splinter, working its way in, a burn, a cut. These are the kinds of injuries that historically demanded immediate action, sometimes life or death action, while itch, most of the time, signals something lower stakes, an insect, a plant, dry skin, a healing scrape. So it would make a certain kind of sense for a nervous system, when forced to choose which signal gets forwarded most urgently to the brain, to let pain win. Scratching, then, isn't really eliminating the itch. It's temporarily drowning it out, using one sensory channel to quiet another, in something researchers sometimes describe with the almost too tidy phrase, gate control. The idea being that the spinal cord acts like a gate, and certain kinds of input can swing that gate partly shut for other kinds of input trying to pass through at the same time. But that's only half of what's happening, and probably not even the more interesting half, because scratching doesn't just interrupt the itch signal on its way up, it also triggers something further along, deeper in the brain, in circuitry connected to reward. Functional imaging studies, the kind where researchers watch blood flow shift through the brain in real time while a person is deliberately made to itch and then allowed to scratch, have found that scratching an itchy patch of skin
activates regions like the ventral striatum and parts of the prefrontal cortex, areas closely associated with pleasure, with the processing of reward, the same general neighborhood of the brain that lights up in response to food, to certain kinds of music, to other small immediate satisfactions. This is worth sitting with for a moment, in the dark, because it means scratching isn't merely the absence of an unpleasant sensation. It's not just relief in the way that finally sitting down after a long day is relief. It appears to be an actively rewarding act in its own right, something the brain, at least briefly, treats as genuinely pleasurable, not simply as the removal of discomfort.
Which perhaps explains something almost everyone has noticed but rarely thinks to question, that certain kinds of scratching, in certain places, at certain intensities, feel disproportionately good, good in a way that seems to exceed what the itch itself would strictly require to be resolved. A scratch on the back, on the scalp, along the forearm, can feel almost luxurious, can produce something close to a small wave of pleasure moving outward from the site, even when the itch prompting it was mild. There's a reason old portraits and letters occasionally mention servants employed, among other things, to scratch an employer's back, and a reason certain animals, dogs most obviously, seem to enter something close to bliss when a particularly itchy spot behind the ear finally gets attended to, hind leg thumping in what looks, and may well be, genuine contentment. The reward system doesn't appear to be picky about why the itch existed in the first place. It simply responds to the scratching itself. Now, here is where the story takes its darker turn, the turn that explains why itching, left unchecked, has such a well-earned reputation for spiraling. Because if scratching is both a pain-based interruption of itch signaling and an actively rewarding act in its own right, then the nervous system has, essentially, built itself a small trap, something that feels this good, that resolves discomfort this immediately and this completely, is something the body will want to repeat, and repeat readily, without much need for conscious deliberation. Unlike, say, the slow, delayed satisfaction of finishing a difficult task, scratching pays out instantly, and the brain, broadly speaking, tends to weight instant rewards more heavily than delayed ones, a tendency researchers have documented across almost every domain of decision-making they've studied, from financial choices to eating to, apparently, skin. But the relief that scratching provides is temporary by its very nature, because it depends on that spinal gate staying shut, and the moment the mild pain signal fades, usually within a few seconds, the gate reopens, and whatever was producing the itch in the first place, the histamine still lingering in the tissue, the dry patch of skin, the nerve ending still irritated, is free to send its signal through again, often with reinforced clarity, since nothing about the underlying cause has actually changed. So the itch returns, and because scratching worked so well and felt so satisfying the first time, the impulse to scratch again arrives almost automatically, without much resistance, because why wouldn't it, given how effective and pleasant it was moments ago? This would perhaps resolve itself harmlessly, a brief cycle of itch and scratch and itch again, fading naturally as whatever triggered it in the first place settles down, except for one further complication, which is that scratching, especially scratching that continues past the point of mild pressure into something firmer, something closer to genuinely breaking the skin's surface tension, causes actual physical changes in the tissue. Skin cells under repeated mechanical stress release their own signaling molecules, some of the same inflammatory compounds involved in the original itch response, histamine among them, along with a handful of other chemical messengers that sensitize nearby nerve endings
making them fire more readily in response to smaller and smaller stimuli. Scratch enough, in other words, and you don't just fail to solve the itch, you manufacture a little more of it, chemically, in the very tissue you were trying to quiet. Dermatologists have a fairly plain, almost blunt name for what happens when this pattern repeats itself over days or weeks in the same patch of skin. They call it the itch-scratch cycle, and it is exactly what it sounds like, a closed loop with no natural exit built into it. Itch producing scratch, scratch producing inflammation, inflammation producing more itch producing more scratch. The affected skin growing thicker and rougher over time in a process with its own technical name, lichenification. The skin's slow, stubborn response to being disturbed again and again in the same place, thickening the way a path through tall grass gets worn smoother and more defined the more feet cross it. And it's this cycle, this small, self-sustaining loop running quietly beneath conscious awareness, that starts to explain something almost everyone with a persistent itch has wondered about at some point, usually somewhere around 2 in the morning, why the itchiest spot on the body so often seems to be the exact spot that was scratched most recently.
Consider, for a moment, how different the causes can be behind a sensation that always seems to announce itself in exactly the same plain, insistent language. An itch never really varies in tone. Whether it comes from a mosquito bite or a wool sweater or the last dry days of scabbing skin on a healed cut, the nerve signal itself reads the same to the brain, a flat, general summons to scratch, with almost none of the qualitative detail that pain manages to carry. Pain tells you sharp or dull, deep or shallow, burning or aching. Itch mostly just tells you here and leaves the rest to guesswork, which is part of why lying still in the dark, trying to figure out what's actually causing a particular itch, can feel oddly like trying to identify a sound with your ears plugged. You get the general direction of the signal and almost none of its origin story. Take the insect bite first, since it is probably the most mechanically dramatic of the everyday causes, though not for the reason most people assume. A mosquito, when she lands, and it is always a she, since only female mosquitoes bite, feeding on blood to nourish developing eggs, doesn't simply puncture skin the way a needle would. She works a thin, flexible mouthpart down through the layers, searching by feel for a small blood vessel, and once she finds one, she introduces a bit of her own saliva into the wound before she begins to feed. That saliva contains proteins, whose entire purpose, from her point of view, is to keep the blood from clotting long enough for her to finish her meal without the vessel sealing shut around her. From the human body's point of view, though, those foreign proteins look like exactly the kind of intruder the immune system is built to notice, and it responds, the way it responds to any unfamiliar protein pushed under the skin, by releasing histamine, dilating tiny blood vessels, calling in the first defenders, and in the process, irritating the very nerve endings that report back as itch. The bump that rises afterward, that small, firm dome of swelling, is essentially a tiny, localized allergic reaction, complete and self-contained, usually settling over a day or two as the immune system finishes its business and stands down. Pollen works through almost the identical chemical pathway, histamine, dilation, nerve irritation, but arrives by an entirely different route, drifting rather than injected, landing on skin or in nasal passages or against the surface of the eye, where it's recognized, in people whose immune systems are primed to recognize it, as a threat worth mounting a response against, even though it is, in any practical sense, harmless. This is one of the stranger quirks of the whole itching system, that the body's alarm apparatus doesn't actually require real danger to go off. It requires only the appearance of danger, a shape it has learned, correctly or not, to treat as suspicious. Pollen looks suspicious to a sensitized immune system for reasons that have more to do with the particular history of that person's immune development than with anything pollen itself is doing. It isn't attacking. It's just floating. Wool, and rough fabrics generally, take a completely different mechanical route to the same nerve endings, and this one has nothing to do with histamine or immune recognition at all. Wool fibers are simply stiffer and coarser than cotton or silk, especially at their cut ends, and when those slightly rigid fibers press and shift against skin, particularly skin that's thin or already somewhat dry, they mechanically deform the surface just enough to trigger the very same nerve fibers that respond to chemical itch signals. It is, in a sense, itch by abrasion rather than itch by inflammation, closer in mechanism to being tickled by a blade of grass than to being bitten by an insect, though the resulting urge to scratch feels indistinguishable once it reaches conscious awareness. Interestingly, this is one of the few kinds of itch where the diameter of the individual fiber matters more than the fabric's overall texture to the touch. Fibers above a certain thickness, roughly 30 microns or so, tend to provoke this response in a lot of people, while finer wool, spun from certain breeds of sheep and processed to remove coarser fibers, often doesn't, which is why some wool sweaters feel prickly against bare skin, and others, chemically almost identical, feel entirely soft. Sweat introduces yet another mechanism, one that's partly chemical and partly about simple blockage. Sweat itself is mostly water, with dissolved salts and a small amount of urea, nothing especially irritating on its own, but when it sits on skin for a while, particularly in folds or under clothing where air doesn't circulate, several things happen at once. The salt residue left behind as sweat evaporates can mildly irritate the skin's surface. Bacteria that live harmlessly on skin under ordinary conditions multiply faster in that warm, damp environment and produce their own byproducts, some of which are mildly irritating in turn. And the sweat ducts themselves, especially if blocked by dead skin cells or by the sweat's own evaporative residue, can become slightly inflamed, a condition familiar to anyone who has ever finished a hot, humid day of physical work and felt a prickling itch across the back and shoulders sometime later, a sensation with its own old descriptive name, prickly heat, that coined long before anyone understood the duct-level mechanics behind it, back when it was simply observed, accurately enough, that heat and sweat together produced a particular kind of stinging itch that cooler, drier skin didn't. Dry air works by nearly the opposite pathway, not through blockage or excess moisture, but through its absence. Skin relies on a certain baseline level of hydration to keep its outermost layer flexible and intact, and that outermost layer, called the stratum corneum, is essentially a wall of overlapping dead cells held together by natural oils and lipids, not unlike roof shingles overlapping to keep water out, except here, the job is to keep water in. When the surrounding air is dry, whether from winter cold, which holds less moisture to begin with, or from indoor heating, which lowers relative humidity even further by warming that already dry air, water migrates out of the skin faster than it's replenished, and the stratum corneum begins to lose its flexibility, sometimes visibly cracking into fine lines, sometimes simply stiffening in a way too subtle to see, but not too subtle to feel. Nerve endings in and near that layer respond to this drying and cracking much the way they respond to any other disruption of the skin's surface, with itch,
which explains why dry winter air produces a itch that feels different in character from an insect bite, less localized, more like a general tightness that hovers over larger stretches of skin, arms and shins especially, rather than announcing itself as a single insistent point. Healing scabs bring their own distinct and almost entirely mechanical explanation, one that has nothing to do with irritants from outside the body at all. As a wound closes, the tissue beneath the scab is doing genuinely intensive construction work, new skin cells migrating in from the wound's edges, new tiny blood vessels forming to supply them, and specialized cells called fibroblasts laying down fresh collagen to rebuild the skin's underlying structure. All of this activity, this cellular traffic and tissue remodeling, releases some of the same chemical messengers involved in ordinary itch signaling, including histamine, simply as a byproduct of so much repair happening in a small space. The scab itself, meanwhile, is drying and contracting as it hardens, physically tugging at the surrounding skin as it does, which adds a mechanical component to the chemical one. It's a strange kind of itch, in that it's actually a reasonably good sign, evidence of the body doing exactly what it should be doing, even though scratching at it, breaking that fragile new tissue open again, can undo days of that careful rebuilding in a matter of seconds.
And then there is the last, quietest category. The kind of itch with no clear cause at all, no bite, no fabric, no dryness, no wound, just a passing, momentary flicker on the back of a hand or behind an ear that appears out of nowhere and vanishes just as quickly once addressed. This kind seems to arise simply from the ordinary, constant low-level activity of nerve endings that are, after all, always somewhat active, always sending some baseline trickle of signal toward the brain, a trickle that occasionally, for reasons too small and too random to trace, crosses the threshold into something noticeable. It isn't a malfunction exactly. It's closer to the electrical equivalent of a settling house at night, small movements, quickly resolved, that mean nothing at all beyond the simple fact that a very large, very sensitive sensory system is doing what such systems do, even when nothing in particular is happening to it. Which brings up a much larger and more restful question worth sitting with next, about what the skin is actually listening for in the first place, and why it seems built to notice so much. There's something else worth sitting with quietly, and it has to do with the strange fact that you don't actually need a mosquito, or a wool sweater, or a healing wound to feel an itch begin. You only need a thought. Somewhere right now, someone reading a sentence about lice, or bedbugs, or a spider crossing a wall, is reaching up to scratch their scalp or their arm without quite deciding to, and there is nothing wrong with them for doing it, and nothing imaginary about the sensation they're having. It's simply one of the more curious features of a nervous system that takes suggestion seriously. Itch, it turns out, is remarkably easy to talk a brain into. Researchers noticed this decades ago in a very simple, almost embarrassingly low-tech way. They would show people a short video of someone else scratching, nothing dramatic, just an ordinary person sitting in an ordinary chair, scratching an arm or a neck the way anyone might on any given afternoon, and then they would count how often the people watching started scratching too. And they did, reliably, far more than chance would predict. The scratching spread through a room of strangers, almost like a yawn does, person to person, without a word being spoken. Some people in these experiments noticed themselves doing it and laughed. Others didn't notice at all, until someone pointed it out, which is perhaps the more telling detail, that the itch had arrived and been acted on before it ever became a conscious thought worth examining. This is called contagious itch, and it isn't unique to humans either. Mice housed near other mice that are scratching will begin scratching more themselves, which rules out any explanation resting purely on language or embarrassment or the specific human habit of scrolling through health articles at 2 in the morning. Something more basic seems to be happening, something built into how mammalian brains process the sight of a particular kind of movement, and in humans, it goes further than watching, reading about itching, hearing about itching, even just being asked questions about how itchy your skin feels right now tends to produce more itching than being asked something neutral. Simply directing attention toward the skin, giving it a reason to be checked, seems to be enough to wake up sensations that would otherwise have passed unnoticed beneath the threshold of awareness. None of this means the itch isn't real. That distinction matters enough to slow down on. When a sensation is triggered by suggestion rather than by a mosquito or a wool fiber, the nerve signal traveling up the arm and into the spinal cord is doing exactly the same physical work it would be doing otherwise. The same receptors are firing. The same chemical messengers, including histamine and a handful of others with more forgettable names, are very often involved. Brain imaging on people experiencing suggestion-triggered itch shows activity in the same regions that light up during itch caused by an actual irritant, the same insular cortex, the same somatosensory areas mapping the body's surface. The itch is not invented out of nothing. It's better understood as a threshold being lowered rather than a signal being manufactured from silence. The nervous system already has a low hum of activity running through it at all times, the same faint trickle mentioned a moment ago, sitting just below the line where a person actually notices it. Suggestion doesn't create a new signal so much as it nudges attention toward the skin and gives an ordinary, otherwise ignorable sensation just enough weight to cross that line into consciousness. Once it's crossed, it feels exactly the way any other itch feels, because it is, in every meaningful sense, another itch, just one with an unusual origin story. This effect has an official cousin, a slightly more solemn one, that doctors run into constantly, called the nocebo effect. Most people have heard the word placebo, the well-documented, thoroughly studied phenomenon in which an inert treatment, a sugar pill, a saline injection, can produce a real, measurable improvement simply because the person taking it expects to feel better. The nocebo effect is its mirror image. Tell someone that a treatment might cause itching as a side effect, and a noticeably larger share of the people taking it will report itching, even when the treatment itself is nothing more than an inactive substance with no plausible way of touching the skin's nerve endings at all. This has shown up again and again in clinical trials, in the control groups given nothing but a placebo pill, where a meaningful fraction of participants still report itching, headaches, fatigue, whatever symptom happened to be listed on the consent form they read before the study began. It's not that these people are mistaken about what they're feeling, it's that the act of expecting a sensation appears to be enough, at least some of the time, to help produce it. There's a reasonable, unglamorous explanation for why a nervous system would work this way, and it has to do with attention rather than suggestibility as some kind of personal weakness. Attention is, among other things, a filter and a necessary one. At every moment,
The skin, all 20-odd square feet of it on an average adult, is sending an almost unmanageable volume of information toward the brain. Pressure here, temperature there, the drag of clothing, the small shifts of skin against a chair. Almost none of this reaches conscious awareness, and for good reason, since a person who consciously registered every square inch of ordinary sensory input at once would find it nearly impossible to do anything else. The brain, quite sensibly, filters almost all of it out by default, treating steady, familiar sensation as background noise not worth reporting. But that filter can be adjusted. Whether that's a thought, a worry, a video of someone scratching, or a printed warning about a possible side effect, the filter loosens in that one location. Sensations that would have stayed below the threshold of notice are suddenly allowed through. It's a bit like sitting in a quiet room with a low, constant hum from a refrigerator somewhere, a hum that vanishes from awareness within minutes of arriving, until someone mentions it, and then, for the rest of the evening, it's oddly difficult to stop hearing. There's a particularly well-documented version of this that shows up around certain skin conditions, chronic itch conditions like eczema or psoriasis, where doctors and researchers have observed that stress, anxiety, and heightened attention toward the skin can measurably worsen the itching a person experiences. Not because the underlying disease has changed, but because the same nervous system loop, attention lowering the threshold, itch crossing into awareness, scratching following soon after, becomes easier to enter and harder to exit. It's a loop, and loops have a way of reinforcing themselves. Worry about itching increases attention to the skin. Increased attention makes itching more noticeable. More noticeable itching increases worry. None of the individual steps in that chain is mysterious or rare. It's the same mechanism, essentially, that makes it so hard to stop noticing a scratchy tag in a shirt collar once you've become aware of it, just operating with slightly higher stakes and a bit more persistence. It's worth saying plainly, since it's easy to hear all of this and draw the wrong conclusion, that none of it means itching is a matter of willpower, or that a person could simply choose not to notice it if they tried hard enough. The mechanism runs mostly outside conscious control, in the same automatic territory as blushing, or the goosebumps that rise on cold skin without any instruction from the thinking part of the brain. Nobody decides to have their itch threshold lowered by a video of someone scratching. It simply happens, quietly, in the background, the way so much of the nervous system's ordinary business happens without ever asking permission first. And this quiet, suggestible responsiveness of the itch system, its willingness to be nudged by expectation and attention, turns out to connect to something even stranger waiting a little further along, the question of what happens when the itch signal reaches the brain at all, and how the brain decides, out of everything arriving from the skin at any given moment, that this particular sensation, out of all of them, deserves to be felt.
Somewhere in the transition from acute itch to chronic itch, something changes that isn't just about volume, isn't simply a matter of the same sensation turned up louder or held on to longer. It changes character. A researcher studying chronic itch patients in a dermatology clinic in the early 2000s noticed something that seemed almost like a contradiction at first. Many of the people with the most severe, most persistent itching had skin that looked, under close examination, nearly normal. No rash to speak of, No visible inflammation, nothing an outside observer would point to and say, "There, that's the cause." And yet the itching was real, was constant, was in some cases severe enough to interfere with sleep, with concentration, with the simple, ordinary business of getting through a day. The mismatch between what the skin showed and what the nervous system reported turned out to be a doorway into a whole different way of understanding itch, one that has taken decades to work out and still isn't fully settled. The short version, though the science underneath it is considerably longer, is that itch, like pain, can become chronic, not because whatever originally caused it is still active, but because the nervous system itself has changed. This is sometimes called sensitization, a term borrowed from the broader study of how sensory systems adapt to repeated or intense signaling. A nerve fiber that has spent months firing itch signals over and over in response to a skin condition that may have partly or even fully resolved, doesn't necessarily go back to its original quiet baseline once the trigger fades. It can settle into a new baseline instead, a more excitable one, more easily triggered, quicker to fire, sometimes firing without any clear trigger at all. Imagine a doorbell that's been rung so many times, so insistently, that it develops a hair trigger and starts sounding off at the faintest vibration in the hallway, a passing car, someone walking past on the sidewalk outside. The bell isn't broken, exactly, it's just been recalibrated by its own history of ringing. This kind of change can happen at more than one level of the nervous system, which is part of what makes chronic itch so difficult to treat with any single approach. It can happen right at the skin, in the density and sensitivity of the itch-specific nerve endings themselves, which in some chronic conditions actually increase in number, branching more thickly through the upper layers of skin than they would in someone without a history of persistent itching. It can happen in the spinal cord, where the relay neurons that pass itch signals upward from skin to brain can become more responsive over time, amplifying signals that would once have been too weak to register as anything at all. And it can happen in the brain itself, in the way attention and expectation and memory get woven into the processing of a sensation that was never, even at the healthiest of times, a purely mechanical readout of what was happening on the skin's surface. 3 different places, 3 different kinds of change, all capable of producing the same subjective experience, itching that persists long after any reasonable observer would expect it to have stopped. This is where the idea of phantom itch becomes useful, borrowed loosely from the more widely known phenomenon of phantom limb pain, in which people who have lost an arm or a leg sometimes continue to feel sensations, sometimes pain, sometimes itching, seemingly located in the missing limb itself. It sounds impossible until you remember where sensation actually happens, which is not in the skin at all, but in the brain's interpretation of signals that were, at some point, associated with that patch of skin. The brain builds and maintains a kind of internal map of the body, and when the input from a region goes silent, whether because a limb has been removed or because a nerve pathway has been damaged, the map doesn't necessarily update cleanly. It can go on generating sensations tied to a region that no longer sends real signals at all, drawing instead on old patterns, old wiring, old habits of firing that persist even after their original source is gone. People who have experienced this kind of phantom itch, and it has been documented since at least the 19th century in surgical patients, sometimes describe it as maddening precisely because it resists the one response that would normally offer relief. You cannot scratch a limb that isn't there. Some patients have reported finding partial relief by scratching the corresponding spot on the opposite, intact limb instead, which suggests that the brain's map has enough symmetry
and enough flexibility built into it that a substitute signal from the mirrored location can sometimes ease a sensation rooted in a location that no longer exists to be touched at all. Chronic itch that doesn't involve any missing limb works on a related principle, even when the skin in question is fully present and accounted for. If the nervous system's wiring for interpreting a certain patch of skin has become sensitized, has become primed to generate itch signals with or without a proportionate trigger, then the itching a person feels is, in a very real sense, a product of that wiring rather than a simple, direct report of present moment skin conditions. This isn't the same as saying the itch is imagined, which is a phrase that has done a great deal of harm over the years to people suffering from chronic itch conditions that doctors couldn't immediately explain. The sensation is real. The nerve signals generating it are real, measurable, physically present in the tissue. What has shifted is the relationship between the signal and its supposed cause, the assumption, usually reliable, that itch means something is currently happening on the skin that warrants attention. In chronic and phantom itch, that assumption can quietly stop holding, even while the itch itself remains every bit as vivid and every bit as demanding of a response. One of the genuinely humbling things about chronic itch, from a medical standpoint, is how often it resists a single tidy explanation. A person who comes to a clinic with itching that has lasted for months, sometimes years, might have it traced eventually to a skin condition, or to a problem with liver function that changes what circulates in the bloodstream and reaches the skin's nerve endings, or to a kidney condition with a similar effect, or to a nerve that's being compressed somewhere along its path in a way that produces itch, rather than the numbness or pain a compressed nerve might be expected to cause, or to a medication whose side effects include a heightened itch response, or in some cases, to no identifiable cause at all, despite exhaustive testing. Doctors sometimes use the term idiopathic for this last category, borrowed from Greek roots meaning, more or less, a condition arising from itself, which is a polite and technical way of admitting that the search for a cause came up empty, at least for now, at least with the tools currently available. It isn't a satisfying answer, and doctors researching chronic itch have written about how frustrating it can be for patient and physician alike to reach the end of a long diagnostic process and find nothing more definite to offer than a description of the mechanism without a clear account of what originally set it in motion. What research has increasingly shown, though, is that this frustration doesn't mean nothing useful is known. It means that itch, examined closely enough, turns out to be less like a single simple alarm system and more like a shared final pathway that many different processes can feed into, the way a river might be fed by dozens of separate streams, each with its own source, each carrying its own particular water, all eventually merging into the same current downstream.
Treating the river without knowing which upstream sources are contributing to it is difficult, which is part of why chronic itch has historically been so hard to manage well, and why the treatments that work for one person's persistent itching sometimes do nothing at all for someone else's, even when the itching itself feels, from the inside, entirely similar. The sameness of the symptom conceals a real diversity of causes: sensitized nerves in the skin, altered relay stations in the spinal cord, changed processing in the brain, circulating substances that shouldn't be there, phantom signals persisting after their source has gone quiet, sometimes several of these at once, layered on top of each other in ways that resist easy separation. And that layered, many-sourced quality of chronic itch turns out to matter for something else too,
something a little more immediate and a little more relevant to anyone lying still in the dark right now, which is the particular, maddening way itching seems to intensify at night, in the quiet hours when the body is supposedly winding down and the skin, by most reasonable expectations, ought to have nothing new to report at all.
Let's step back from the immediate, personal experience of itching for a moment and ask a wider, older question. Why would a nervous system evolve to produce this sensation at all? Not pain, which has an obvious and urgent logic to it, warning of tissue damage severe enough to demand instant withdrawal. Itch is stranger. It's quieter, more insistent than urgent, and it asks for a very specific, very small action, not a flinch away from danger, but a scratch, a precise mechanical response aimed at one particular patch of skin. To understand why that peculiar signal exists, it helps to think not about any one person scratching an arm in the dark, but about generations upon generations of ancestors, human and otherwise, encountering the everyday hazards of having skin in a world full of small things that want to land on it, bite it, burrow into it, or lay eggs in it. Consider for a moment what skin actually is to the rest of the biological world. It's a border. It's the outer wall of a fortress, and like any fortress wall, it's under fairly constant probing attack, mostly by creatures far too small to fight in any conventional sense. Mosquitoes searching for a blood vessel close enough to the surface to tap. Ticks questing along a blade of grass, waiting to grab hold of anything warm that brushes past. Fleas, lice, mites, various worms whose larvae are perfectly happy to use skin as a doorway into a body. None of these are things a primate, or for that matter a bird, or a dog, or nearly any mammal, can afford to simply ignore. A single flea is a trivial nuisance. A skin, persistently colonized by parasites, is a much larger problem, one that drains blood, spreads disease, and over time can measurably damage health and reduce the chances of surviving to reproduce. So, evolution, working as it does, not through foresight, but through the blind accumulation of whatever happens to work, seems to have arrived at a solution. Build a detection system in the skin, sensitive enough to notice the faint mechanical disturbance of a tiny creature landing, walking, or beginning to bite. Wire that detection system so that its signal isn't just noticed, but is actively unpleasant, insistent enough that it can't easily be ignored or postponed. Then link that unpleasant sensation to a very specific motor reflex, the scratch, which is, when you actually consider what it accomplishes, a remarkably well-suited tool for the job. A scratch disrupts the surface of the skin exactly where the disturbance was detected. It can dislodge a crawling insect before it settles in to feed. It can interrupt a mosquito mid-bite before it delivers its full dose of saliva and the pathogens that saliva sometimes carries. It can, at the very least, make the skin a less hospitable, more chaotic surface for something small and vulnerable to hold on to. There's a nice, almost domestic parallel here, one that would have been obvious to anyone living before modern insect repellents and window screens existed, and remains obvious to anyone who's ever watched an animal go about its day. Watch a dog after a walk through tall grass, working its teeth and paws systematically along its own fur. Watch a cat spend what seems like an improbable fraction of its waking life licking and nibbling at its coat. Watch birds run their beaks along each feather, one at a time,
in a ritual called preening that looks almost meditative from the outside, but serves a very practical purpose: removing parasites, redistributing oils that keep feathers waterproof, checking, section by section, that the outer surface of the body is in good order. Grooming, across an enormous range of species, occupies a startling amount of time and energy, and researchers who study animal behavior have long treated that time and energy as itself a kind of evidence. If grooming didn't matter for survival, natural selection would have little reason to preserve behavior that costs so much time and leaves an animal briefly distracted, its guard lowered, while it works over its own fur or feathers instead of watching for predators. The fact that grooming persists, elaborate and time-consuming, across birds and mammals, separated by tens of millions of years of separate evolution, suggests it earns its keep. Itch, seen from this angle, is what makes targeted grooming possible in the first place. A general, undirected urge to occasionally check one's fur wouldn't be nearly as efficient as a system that says, specifically, here, this exact spot, something is happening right here. Right shoulder blade. Left ankle, just above the sock line. The signal doesn't just prompt action, it aims it. The way a small, precise tap on the arm draws attention far more efficiently than a vague general feeling that something, somewhere, might need attention. In this light, the itch and the scratch together form what some researchers describe as a lightweight, low-cost, but remarkably fast early warning and response system, faster in many ways than the immune system's slower chemical defenses, faster than waiting for an infection to develop and then fighting it off, faster than any strategy that depends on noticing a problem only after it has already become serious. A fraction of a second of mechanical disturbance on the skin, translated almost instantly into motor action. It's hard to think of many bodily systems that operate on a shorter loop. This kind of explanation, sometimes called an evolutionary or functional account, doesn't try to describe the itch you might be feeling on your calf right now, in terms of nerve fibers and neurotransmitters and receptor types, the way earlier sections of this description did. It tries instead to answer a different, older question, not how does itch work, but why does a capacity to itch exist in the world at all, and why did it get built and preserved across such a wide range of species?
And the honest scientific answer is that biologists remain genuinely uncertain about many of the details here, uncertain how strong the parasite defense pressure really was, compared to other possible explanations, uncertain how directly today's itch pathways trace back to whatever ancient version first appeared. What's reasonably well supported is the general shape of the idea that a fast, localized, hard-to-ignore signal tied to a precise scratching reflex would have been useful, plausibly useful enough to be worth keeping, generation after generation, in creatures whose skin was, and still is, a border under constant small-scale siege. Which brings us, gently, to the part of this that tends to feel less like ancient history and more like an ongoing, mildly absurd inconvenience. Because if itch evolved as an alarm tuned to the presence of something on the skin, a mosquito settling in, a tick beginning its slow attachment, a strand of wool fiber working its way against bare skin, the way it might have against fur, then it's an alarm built for a world with far more of those small physical intrusions in it than most people encounter today. Most nights, lying in a clean bed, under a laundered sheet, in a room with no fleas and no ticks and, with any luck, no mosquitoes either, there's nothing there. No parasite is questing across the skin looking for a place to bite. And yet the alarm can still go off,
It fires in response to dry skin flaking gently against itself. It fires in response to a stray thread, a slightly rough seam, the brush of a blanket edge against sensitive skin. It fires sometimes for reasons that seem to trace back not to the skin at all, but to the nervous system's own internal wiring, misfiring the way an old smoke detector might occasionally shriek at nothing more than a bit of steam from a shower, having been built to err generously on the side of catching every genuine fire, and therefore unavoidably prone to occasional false alarms as well. This is, in a sense, the price of having a detection system built for sensitivity rather than precision. A system tuned to catch every genuine threat, every real parasite making contact with skin, is almost necessarily going to be a system that sometimes responds to things that aren't threats at all. Evolution doesn't optimize for a calm, quiet nervous system that never bothers anyone unnecessarily. It optimizes, roughly and imperfectly, for survival, and a slightly oversensitive alarm that occasionally sends someone scratching at nothing costs very little in the currency evolution cares about, compared to the very real cost of an undersensitive alarm that lets a disease-carrying insect finish its meal undisturbed. The ancient logic of the system favored a hair trigger, and a hair trigger, transplanted into a modern bedroom, largely free of the pressures it was built for, is going to trip more often than it strictly needs to. There's something almost touching in that, honestly, once you sit with it for a moment. The itch on your shoulder tonight, if there is one, however faint, however easily forgotten a minute from now, is very likely the same basic machinery that once helped some distant ancestor notice, in time, that something small and unwelcome had landed on bare skin in the grass or by the fire. The circuitry is doing exactly what it was built to do, watching, however imperfectly, for the kind of contact that used to matter enormously, and now, most of the time, simply doesn't. And understanding that doesn't make the itch disappear, of course. But it does begin to explain something about why the skin can feel so restless at exactly the moment the rest of the body has finally agreed to be still, which is worth sitting with a little longer before drifting further into what the nervous system does with that restlessness once the lights go out completely.
Consider, for a moment, what happens when one animal grooms another. Not the mechanics of it exactly, but the sheer strangeness of the fact that so many creatures, across so many branches of the family tree of life, spend real time and real energy running their hands, or paws, or beaks, or tongues over another individual's body, removing things that individual could not easily remove alone. A chimpanzee working through the fur on another chimpanzee's back, parting the hair in careful sections, picking out flecks of dried skin and the occasional insect, is doing something that looks, on the surface, almost meditative, unhurried, repetitive in a way that seems to soothe both the groomer and the groomed. And it is tempting, watching this, to assume it is simply about hygiene, a practical service exchanged between animals that happen to live in groups. But researchers who have spent long hours watching primates groom each other have noticed that the amount of time spent this way, in many species, goes well beyond what would be strictly necessary just to keep the fur free of parasites. Something else seems to be happening underneath the practical layer. That something else appears to involve the nervous system directly, in ways that echo, distantly, the very itch and scratch circuitry this narration has been tracing all along. Gentle, rhythmic stroking of the skin, in a great many mammals, triggers the release of certain calming signals in the body, the kind associated with lowered stress, slowed heart rate, a general settling. There is a particular class of nerve fiber, found in the skin of many mammals including humans, that seems especially tuned to slow, gentle stroking at roughly the speed of a caress, and largely uninterested in fast or sharp contact. It is a curious kind of specialization, a sensory channel built not primarily for detecting threat, but for registering a particular, unhurried quality of touch, and it feeds into brain regions associated with social bonding and comfort, rather than alarm. Grooming, in other words, may be doing double duty. It clears the fur, yes, but it also seems to be quietly recalibrating the nervous system of the animal being groomed, nudging it toward calm, in a way that has very little to do with parasites at all. This matters for understanding itch, because it suggests that the skin's sensory world was never built to handle only one kind of message. It was built, from very early in the story of animal life, to carry both the urgent, unpleasant signal of unwanted contact and the quiet, pleasant signal of wanted contact, and to keep those two channels distinct enough that an animal could tell the difference between a parasite and a companion without much confusion. A common frame among researchers is that these are, in effect, two separate systems layered into the same organ, evolved separately, serving very different purposes, and mostly cooperating rather than interfering with each other. When they interact, interesting things happen. One light touch from a trusted companion can sometimes ease the urge to scratch, at least briefly, the way a hand on a child's back can quiet a fussy evening. And a touch from a stranger, identical in pressure and speed, can sometimes provoke the opposite reaction entirely, tightening the skin, prickling faintly, because context and trust shape how the same physical signal gets interpreted once it reaches the brain. Birds offer their own version of this story, one worth sitting with for a moment before drifting elsewhere. Many bird species preen each other, running their beaks carefully through a partner's feathers, particularly around the head and neck, places a bird cannot easily reach with its own beak. This mutual preening, sometimes called allopreening by researchers who study it, shows up especially in birds that form long-term pair bonds, and it tends to concentrate on exactly the areas an individual bird cannot groom itself. That detail matters. It suggests the behavior isn't only about the pleasure of being touched, though that likely plays some role, but also about a kind of practical cooperation, two individuals solving together a problem that neither could fully solve alone. A pigeon cannot preen the feathers directly behind its own head. A partner can. One offering access to a blind spot, the other tending it, in an exchange that looks almost like an unspoken agreement quietly renewed each day. What's worth noticing here, drifting a little further into the question of learned attention versus something more automatic, is that not all of this grooming behavior arrives instinctively, fully formed. Some of it does. A newly hatched bird will often show basic preening motions with no instruction at all, the same way a human infant will scratch reflexively at an irritation on its own skin long before it has any real understanding of what an itch is. But a great deal of social grooming, particularly among primates, seems to be shaped and refined through experience, through watching, through the slow accumulation of what works and what doesn't within a particular group. Young primates in some studied groups appear to groom clumsily at first, spending time in the wrong places, applying pressure that seems slightly mismatched to what the recipient wants, and gradually improving as they watch older, more practiced individuals and adjust. This is learned attention in a fairly literal sense, attention trained onto particular details, particular techniques, through repetition and correction over time. Contrast this with something quite different,
a phenomenon closer to what earlier parts of this narration touched on when discussing contagious yawning and contagious scratching among humans. In several species, researchers have documented what looks like scratching that spreads through a group, not because anyone learned to do it, and not because there's any actual itch being communicated, but because observing one individual scratch appears to trigger a kind of automatic echo in nearby individuals, almost involuntarily. This has been studied in some primate groups, where one animal beginning to scratch appears to measurably increase the likelihood that others nearby will begin scratching shortly after, even in the absence of any shared parasite exposure, any shared physical irritant. The pattern resembles what happens in a room full of humans when one person coughs or yawns and several others follow within moments, seemingly against their own will, or at least without their own permission. It's automatic, or close to it, contagious in a way that owes little to instruction, and much to something built into the way certain nervous systems respond to watching another body in a particular state. The distinction between these two things, learned technique on one hand and automatic contagion on the other, is worth holding gently in mind, because they can look similar from the outside while arising from very different places. A young chimpanzee, carefully copying an older animal's grooming style, adjusting pressure and rhythm through trial and correction across weeks and months, is engaged in something closer to apprenticeship. A chimpanzee that begins scratching within seconds of watching a groupmate scratch, with no apparent itch of its own to explain it, is displaying something faster, less deliberate, closer to reflex than to skill. Both are real. Both show up across a wide range of species, though not identically in each, and both hint at how deeply social the skin's sensory world actually is, how much it seems built not just for one body in isolation, but for bodies existing among other bodies, watching them, responding to them, occasionally borrowing their sensations without quite meaning to. Even solitary creatures, of course, groom themselves extensively, and this too carries traces of the same underlying machinery, stripped of the social layer, but still functioning. A cat left entirely alone will still spend a notable portion of its waking hours licking and nibbling at its own fur, working through the same basic maintenance that social grooming accomplishes for others, self-directed because there's no one else present to help. This suggests the core itch and scratch system long predates the social embellishments built on top of it, that the capacity to detect an irritation and respond to it evolved first as something private, something handled alone, and only later, in species that came to live in close proximity with others, did it grow this additional social dimension, this quiet exchange of attention between one body and another, at once practical, and in its own understated way, something close to tender.
So let's come back, now, at the end, to the simplest possible version of the question that started all of this. Why do you itch? And the honest answer, after everything we've walked through, is that no single mechanism holds the whole thing. It's not just the skin, though the skin matters enormously. It's not just the nerves, though the nerves are the ones doing the actual signaling. It's not just the brain, though the brain is where the sensation is finally, quietly assembled into something you notice. It's all of these together, layered, overlapping, sometimes agreeing with each other and sometimes not, and the itch you feel on any given night is the result of that whole system settling, briefly, into a particular shape. Think back to the skin itself, that thin covering you rarely think about until it asks for attention. It's not a passive wrapper, it's an active, sensing surface. packed with nerve endings, tuned to different kinds of information, some built to detect pressure, some temperature, some the particular chemical signature of a mosquito's saliva or the drying edge of a healing scrape. Histamine, released by cells stationed just beneath the surface, was one of the first messengers discovered to trigger this response, and for decades it was treated as though it explained the whole phenomenon. But you now know that isn't quite right. There are histamine-independent pathways too, itches that no antihistamine will touch, driven by other molecules entirely, other routes into the same basic sensation. The skin, in other words, has more than one way of saying something is wrong here, or something is different here. Come pay attention. And then there are the nerves that carry that message onward, the long, thin fibers running from skin to spinal cord to brain. And here, too, the story turned out to be less tidy than early researchers hoped. For a long time, it was assumed that itch traveled along the same pathways as pain, just a weaker version of the same signal, pain turned down low. That assumption held for decades because it was simple, and because from the outside, the two sensations do share certain features, the same reflexive impulse to respond, the same capacity to demand attention. But careful work, much of it only in recent decades, revealed dedicated itch fibers, cells that respond to itch-producing substances and largely ignore straightforward pain, cells whose job seems to be specifically this one narrow sensation, separate from injury signaling, running its own distinct line up toward the brain. Pain and itch turned out to be cousins rather than the same thing wearing two names. But even a clean signal traveling up a dedicated nerve doesn't produce a sensation by itself. It arrives as information, and the brain has to decide what to do with it. And this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because the brain doesn't simply receive and display, it predicts. It holds a kind of running model of the body, built from a lifetime of prior sensations, and new signals are interpreted against that model rather than read off in isolation. This is why a wool sweater might itch unbearably the first time you wear it, and feel almost neutral by the fifth, not because the fibers changed, but because your nervous system updated its expectations and stopped treating the sensation as something requiring urgent notice. It's also, more unsettlingly, why the mere sight of something crawling, or the mere mention of lice, or even just reading a detailed description of insects on skin, can produce a real itch on real skin with nothing physically present to explain it. The brain's prediction was strong enough to generate the sensation on its own, borrowing the pattern from memory and expectation rather than waiting for fresh input from the body's own sensors. This predictive quality connects to something else you learned earlier about attention itself, about how deliberately trying not to think about an itch tends to make it worse rather than better, in something like an ironic loop, where the effort of suppression keeps circling back to the very thing you were trying to set aside. And it connects, too, to the puzzle of relief, that particular satisfaction that comes with scratching, which turns out to have its own neurochemical signature, its own brief involvement of reward pathways, its own small release that makes the whole business feel less like mere symptom management and more like something the nervous system is, in a strange way, designed to enjoy, at least for a few seconds, before the itch quietly returns and asks again. And then there's the paradox, sitting at the very center of it all, the one that puzzled scientists for so long precisely because it seemed to contradict itself. Scratching, mechanically, should relieve itch, and largely it does, at least briefly. But scratching also activates certain pain-sensitive fibers, and pain signals are known to suppress itch signals somewhere in the spinal cord, a kind of gating system where one sensation can crowd out another, competing for the same limited channel upward. So the very act that seems to soothe an itch may work partly by recruiting a milder form of pain to override it, a small, controlled discomfort deployed against a larger, more diffuse one. This is why scratching too hard, breaking skin, crosses a threshold where the relief disappears and only injury remains, and why the itch that follows healing wounds seems to hover right at the boundary between comfort and harm, asking to be managed rather than simply obeyed. None of this exists without habit, either. The way the body and the routines built around it settle into patterns over time. A scratch repeated enough times in response to a particular trigger, a certain fabric, a certain time of evening, a certain emotional state, becomes a kind of learned behavior, wired in through repetition, the same way any habitual motion becomes wired in, sometimes outlasting the original cause entirely, so that the hand reaches for the same spot on the wrist, not because anything is currently irritating it, but because the reaching itself has become an automatic sequence, triggered as much by memory and association as by fresh sensation. This is part of why chronic itch conditions can be so difficult to fully resolve even after the original cause has been treated. The nervous system and the behavior built on top of it sometimes keeps running the old pattern a while longer out of sheer habit, the way a path through a field stays visible in the grass long after anyone stopped walking it regularly. And underneath all of this, quietly present the whole time, is the social layer, the fact that itch and scratching don't only happen in isolated bodies, but ripple outward between bodies too, contagious in a way that seems almost too strange to be real until you notice it happening in yourself, that faint prickle rising just from watching someone else scratch, or even just talking about the subject at length, as you may be noticing right now, lying still, listening to this. That contagion isn't a flaw in the system. It's a feature that runs deep into evolutionary history, showing up in chimpanzees and mice, and very likely other creatures whose inner experience we can only guess at. A signal passed between bodies, the same way a yawn moves through a room, unbidden, mostly unnoticed, doing whatever quiet work it does in binding one nervous system loosely to another. So here you are, at the end of all this explaining, lying in the dark, with a body that is, at this very moment, still doing all of it, skin quietly monitoring itself, nerves carrying whatever small signals arise, real or imagined, urgent or trivial, a brain continuously predicting what the next sensation will be, mostly getting it close enough that you don't notice the guessing at all. This is true of itch, but it isn't only true of itch. It's true of nearly every sensation you carry through the day and into the night. The felt sense of a body that seems so immediate, so simply given, is in fact being built, moment by moment, out of signal and expectation and memory, a construction so smooth and so continuous that it never feels like construction at all. It just feels like being here, being yourself, resting in the particular arrangement of skin and nerve and quiet attention that happens to be you tonight.
There's nothing left to solve right now. No itch to chase, no explanation still owed. Just the slow settling of a body that has been, this whole time, quietly doing exactly what it was built to do, sensing itself, predicting itself, and now, gradually, letting all of that quiet down into something softer, something closer to sleep. Rest well.